Good evening, everybody. Just bear with us for a little while as more people are joining us. So we'll start in about a minute. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us at Fortis Law. This is Jacqueline, Business Development Manager with Fortis Law, and I really appreciate your time with us this evening. This evening, we're going to sit with Shailey from Aware and Chee Jia from Fortis Law on this webinar dealing with domestic violence and harassment. So please feel free to leave your questions in the chat group. You may actually send your questions to me privately, or at the end of the webinar, we'll actually have a time for Q&A. And at that time, if you feel more comfortable asking your question, just unmute yourself and ask your question. So thank you. So this evening, Fortis Law invites you to sit with Shailey, Head of Advocacy, Research and Communications from Aware, and Ms. Chee Jia, a private client lawyer with 7 years of specialist experience in family law, as they debunk the myths on domestic violence, share the ways to identify and support domestic violence victims, and share the legal actions available to help the victims. So let's just sit back, enjoy the webinar, and I'm sure you're going to find this a very interesting one. Thank you. And over to you, Shailey.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Shailey Hingorani. Like Jacqueline mentioned, I'm the head of research and advocacy at Aware. Fortis Law, Jacqueline, everybody behind this event, thank you so much for organizing this important session. I'll be focusing my presentation on the basics. And if I could just get my slides up. Thank you. Thank you. So like I was saying, I'll be focusing my presentation on the basics. What is domestic violence? What it looks like in Singapore? What are some common myths about domestic violence and some basic steps you can take to help a friend, colleague, or neighbor if you suspect that they might be experiencing domestic violence? First off, let me start with a definition so that we're all on the same page. Now, this is not a legal definition. The second presentation will cover that. But at Aware, we subscribe to a particular definition. Now, broadly speaking, people often think of domestic violence only in terms of, the black eyes and bruises that can be seen. However, in reality, domestic violence is a pattern of violent, threatening, coercive, or controlling behavior. It can occur in current or previous intimate relationships. It can take many forms. It could include physical violence, emotional abuse, financial abuse, and it can also include a combination of different types of abuse. Next slide, please. Now, what does it actually look like? I've picked out some examples of calls we received last year on Aware's Women's Helpline. These calls, as hopefully you can see, encompass the whole spectrum of problematic and abusive behaviors I described earlier. And I want to go category by category to give you some concrete examples. Starting with physical violence or the threat of violence, we received calls on our women's helpline from women who had been kicked or punched by their spouses. Some have called us to say that their partners are threatening them with physical violence. A caller told us that the abuser had a knife in hand last night and they were threatening to kill themselves. Moving on to the second category, which is controlling behaviors. I think controlling behaviors are often difficult to understand. So let me give you one specific example. Tanya, this is not her real name, reported to us that her abuser likes to control her activities by setting curfews for her and her kids. He locks the door to the house if they're not home by the curfew. And at home, when everybody is around, he also likes to control their use of Wi-Fi, air conditioning, and other sort of types of technology they're dependent on. Other calls that we have received on controlling behavior include spouses not giving access to their children or stonewalling divorced spouses. Calls from women have also sort of highlighted to us that partners may sometimes prevent them from seeing counselors for emotional support. Now, traditionally, we tend to think of domestic violence as happening between intimate partners, between husband or wife, but it's so much more than that, right? Another category of calls we received on the Women's Helpline actually had to do with elder abuse. We received calls, and these were calls from older persons who were experiencing threats and humiliation from their adult children they were dependent on for their mobility as well as caregiving needs. Next slide, please. Now, although the calls I mentioned were received last year, including during circuit breaker, so if you look at the graph on the right, you will notice the month-on-month increase in the number of calls we received during the circuit breaker months. And remember, these calls have to specifically do with domestic violence. Now, the calls that we received last year, and this is important because we get so many questions about this, are not new cases of violence. They're not cases where up until the circuit breaker, everything was rosy and romantic, and COVID-19 sort of hit and bam, the relationship turned abusive overnight. The cases we saw last year were of relationships that were already abusive. But what happened during circuit breaker and in subsequent months was that the abuse flared up. For example, whereas pre-COVID, the relationship could have involved emotional abuse, it now involved threats of physical violence. Or, it's possible that there had been a long period of lull in an abusive relationship, but it suddenly turned violent again. There's another set of numbers that I think is worth paying attention to, which is the number of PPO, personal protection orders, that were filed in 2020. And you can have a look at the numbers from the previous years as well. Now, you'll hear about the purpose of these orders and how to file them in the next presentation, but I wanted to highlight them here as a proxy for the prevalence of domestic violence. Now, you might look at these numbers and think, domestic violence is not so bad. But remember, these numbers just indicate the people who got in touch with us to ask for help and or filed protection orders. Domestic violence actually is hugely underreported. The UN estimates that less than 40% of women who are physically abused at home seek any kind of help. So the numbers that you're seeing only reflect those who are reporting. There are many others who are unfortunately suffering in silence. Next slide, please. Now, prevalence is one way to think about domestic violence, right? Another way to grapple with the issue is to get a better sense of how Singaporeans think about domestic violence, how well they understand it. And for this slide, I will rely on a survey that was done in 2019 of 300 Singaporeans that found that while 84% of Singaporeans consider that hitting a spouse and leaving a physical wound constitutes domestic abuse, but this percentage actually drops to 75% if one hits a spouse but does not leave a physical wound. It further drops when we talk about psychological abuse. So only 56% of those who were surveyed think that behaviors that involve psychological abuse constitute domestic violence. 55% was the number for restricting access to healthcare. And when it came to exerting control over finances, only 48% of those who were surveyed identified that as domestic violence. Next slide, please. Now, one possible explanation for why we don't have such a good grasp of certain kinds of domestic violence is because we have misconceptions about who domestic violence actually happens to. So even if our well-to-do friend were to tell us that their husband is controlling their spending, because the friend doesn't fit the stereotypical idea we have of what a victim looks like, we don't actually consider that domestic violence and don't offer support to our friend. We think domestic violence is more prevalent in lower income communities, in minority communities, but actually domestic violence doesn't discriminate. Anyone of any race, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion can be a victim or a perpetrator of domestic violence. It can happen to people who are married, it can happen to people who are living together, who are dating, it can happen to parents, it can happen to kids. It affects people of all socioeconomic backgrounds as well as education levels. Having said that, and I think this is worth paying attention to, there are certain groups of women who may be more vulnerable because of certain structural factors, such as their ability to maintain their visa status, their right to stay in Singapore independently. I'm thinking about migrant spouses of Singaporean citizens. Aware, in fact, found that migrant spouses call the Women's Helpline about family violence at twice the rate of local women. Some other groups of women that we think are especially vulnerable include women with disabilities and caregivers. And this is because they often depend on their caregivers for mobility. So they may think this is the cost to pay for being cared for. Another group has to do with domestic work, so domestic workers. Although we don't have a lot of visibility on this issue in terms of data, but we know that domestic workers are completely isolated with the abuser and dependent on the employer for their continued stay in Singapore. Many of them are also in enormous debt, and this may force them to put up with the abuse and continue working so that they can pay off the debt. Now, other categories of myths include misconceptions we have about the perpetrator, his emotional state, and often about the violence itself. So if you were to look at myths about the perpetrator, we often believe that perpetrators use violence because they get so angry that they're out of control. However, perpetrators who use violence against their partners do not usually beat other people up, right? If violence reflected a person's sort of inability to control oneself, then it is highly unlikely rather, that the same target would be singled out time after time. Abusers tend not to behave in public. Oops, my slides just disappeared. Thank you. So I was talking about abusers, right? And how they tend to behave in public. Now, you'll often hear this, right? That their behavior in public is not consistent with their behavior at home. For example, most abusers do not beat their boss when they become angry in the workplace, but they will beat their partner when they get home. And that should tell us something. It tells us that violence is actually not an uncontrollable act. Another common myth that is repeatedly perpetuated is that drugs and alcohol use causes domestic violence. Now, blaming alcohol or drugs is, I think, another way to get out from under the responsibility for domestic violence, for abusive behavior. Substance abuse and domestic violence are two separate problems, which of course they can occur together, but treating one will not cure the other. Substance abuse may increase the frequency or the severity of the violent episodes in some cases, but they are not solely responsible for creating violent situations. The final category of myths I want to talk about is myths we have about the violence itself. Now, we often believe that domestic violence is a personal problem, right, between a husband and a wife. In fact, the survey that I mentioned earlier with, the one that surveyed 300 Singaporeans, found that 1 in 5 believes that domestic abuse should not be reported by others, as it is more important to preserve the sanctity of marriage. But we know that it's not just a personal problem, right? And we see this sort of repeated over and over again, which is quite unfortunate. Next slide, please. Now, I know that it can be fairly dispiriting and disempowering, right, to hear that we as a society might be failing victims of domestic violence by not recognizing that the behaviors they have been experiencing constitute abuse. We are also guilty of condoning, of excusing the abusive behavior of perpetrators, as well as brushing sort of the violence under the carpet, right? But I think that it is possible for all of us to educate ourselves, to train ourselves, to spot some common signs of abuse. And of course, I'm not saying that we will always come across situations where there are visible signs of abuse. Sometimes there may not be any signs, right? You might just have a gut feeling that something is wrong. And if you get that sense, I highly recommend checking in with that person, whether that person is a friend, a colleague, or a neighbor. Some of the signs that we can be on the lookout for include, let's say your friend seems afraid of her partner or is always very anxious to please them. If you're talking to her on the phone, she may cut the phone conversation short when her partner walks into the room. Maybe you're, on a phone call with her and you can hear her partner criticizing or humiliating her. That's another sign. If you happen to see your friend with her partner and you notice that the partner is sort of ordering her about and making all the decisions for her, including, ordering food for her in a restaurant, that's another sign. Sometimes you will find that, friends, neighbors, and colleagues will talk about, when they talk about their partners, they'll talk about their partner's jealousy, bad temper, or possessiveness, right? And there may be other indications, such as your friend may, you notice that your friend has become more anxious or comes across as being depressed. She may have lost her confidence, or if she was really talkative, like to talk, and now she's become unusually quiet. I think those are changes in behavior that we should pay attention to. At events on domestic violence, we are often asked, it's one thing to ask your friend or your neighbor, somebody you have a close relationship with, whether or not they're experiencing domestic abuse, but are there signs that you can see and spot in colleagues, right? And is it appropriate for you to interfere in the life of your colleague if you think something is wrong? I think that there are definitely signs, right, that you can spot in your colleagues' behaviors. And some of these include, you might notice that she used to be really punctual. She always delivered her work on time, but now she's behind on deadlines. And you notice that her productivity has dropped. If you notice these sort of changes in behavior, it's perfectly fine for you to check in with your colleague to say that you've noticed that she's not behaving the way she usually does, and to offer to lend a hearing, to lend a ear, right, to her problems. And I think that's important to remember. If we move on to the next slide, I would like to talk about how exactly we can provide support, right? And I have 3 quick recommendations for you all. First, I think it's really important to keep communication open. And this is what I was trying to get at with, checking in with your friend, colleague, or neighbor, whoever it might be. I think it's really important that we keep talking and keep being there for this person, because it's possible that the abuser has completely isolated them. And the conversation with you is the only contact they have with the outside world. They may even think of this contact as being a lifeline. And it's important that when you're talking to victims of domestic abuse, you're non-judgmental, right? You don't judge them for actions they have taken, for decisions they have taken. It's important for them to know that they're not alone and that you believe them, that you're not thinking that they have made up the domestic violence, or made up how troubled their relationship is with their spouse or whoever else it might be. Some helpful things that we can say include, when you're talking to your friend, for instance, you could say, this conversation, it'll stay between us, and that you will not share anything without their permission. I think it's important to create that safe space, that confidential space. And you can do that by clearly articulating that whatever your friend is telling you is going to remain with you. It's also important to check in on their safety. And one simple way to do that is to ask them whether they're safe at the moment. So the moment, when you're talking to them, are they safe then? And are they safe overall? And the response to these questions can often tell you, but also whether or not they're feeling safe in the moment you're talking to them. It's also important while you're talking to them to figure out if they have any sources of support, right? And the way to ask about this is to say, is there anyone that you trust that you can go to for support? Because it's possible that you might not be available the next time there's a flare up in the abuse. And so it'll be important for you to help your friend sort of imagine who else they can get in touch with when the time arises. Of course, it's also important to say that you're sorry that this happened to you. You're sorry that they have been abused, that they're having to sort of live with the abuser if that happens to be the case, and to remind them that it's not their fault, that they did not do anything to bring this on. Often we will hear from women who tell us that their abusers will tell them that they are abusing them because of something the victim did, which is why these words, "it's not your fault," are so powerful, because they remind the victim that it's not anything they did that made the abuser fly off the handle, right? That's on them. They need to take responsibility for that. When you're thinking about other forms of support that you could provide, you should write down, create a list of all the helpful sort of helplines, counseling services, legal help that are available, so that you can pass these on to your friend, to your neighbor quite easily, so that they don't have to spend time looking for these numbers. Next slide, please. Now, the second thing to do is to absolutely manage expectations, right? I think you should be honest about what kind of help you can offer. Someone who's leaving, a domestic abuse situation, they may need money, they may need a place to stay, or someone to help with childcare, right? If you're able to provide any of these, great, be upfront about that. But if you're not, you should be equally upfront, so that when your friend is planning and plotting her escape, she knows who she can turn to for money, who she can turn to, for a place to stay, and so on and so forth. I think you should also be sort of careful about clearly sort of indicating to them that even though you're not able to help them in material ways, you are around to listen, right? And this connects back to the first recommendation that I made, which was to keep communication open. Remember that victims are not just looking for money. They're not just looking for a place to stay. Sometimes they're just looking for that emotional support. So keep listening and actively listening, and actively sharing information on available resources. Next slide, please. So my third and final sort of recommendation on how to lend support to your friend who you suspect might be experiencing abuse is to not call the abuser. I think victims know best how to keep themselves safe. They know their abuser better than anyone. So don't entertain any grandiose sort of ideas about saving them from their abuser. Don't be tempted to call the abuser just because you think that, if you were to confront them, that might help stop the abuse. That is rarely the case. Unrequested contact in fact, often means there is a higher chance that they will blame the victim for talking about it and punish them for it. So don't try and act as if you're the hero in this situation. Next slide, please. For my final couple of slides, I wanted to focus on the work that AWARE does on domestic violence. Now, AWARE's Women's Helpline, which has been running since 1991, provides emotional support and practical advice on reporting, on navigating the family justice system, police reporting, information on shelters, medical options that are available for victims. Of course, like most nonprofits working on domestic violence, AWARE has had to remove all our operations, all our operations online in a relatively short period of time during COVID. We also had to innovate in addition to providing a regular service. And now these new services have actually become a part of our work. During the circuit breaker months, as we received real-time information from our women's helpline, and we had people sort of reaching out to us on social media, we realized pretty quickly that in order to engage with abuse victims and survivors, we needed to align our services with the evolving needs of abuse victims and survivors. We needed to offer them multiple ways to connect, including text messages or online chat for more sort of discrete conversations. We did this in a few different ways. First, inspired somewhat by Snapchat's Here For You campaign, we worked with Twitter to create an in-app model such that when a user searched, for example, for abuse, they were connected to a range of resources to assist with various concerns and circumstances related to domestic violence. We also worked with Love Bonito, which is a local clothing business, to provide information about domestic violence and how to reach out for support. This was important because Love Bonito is an unassuming app, right? An app that an abusive person is unlikely to monitor or look through. Finally, and I think most importantly, we also launched a chat service. The text chat service was available over Zoom, and it continues to be available over Zoom, and was for women who had experienced or were experiencing abuse and violence, but they were unable to find a safe space to speak on the phone, to access help. The service could be made available at a time that was convenient to them. All they had to do was quickly fill out a form to let us know when they would like to chat. Now, while online options were obviously a fantastic alternative to providing and receiving services discreetly, we also recognized that this heavy reliance on technology could be used as a new vector of abuse. As a result, we started including technology education as part of the service we provided. We included, for instance, an overview of safety-oriented applications and tools. We told clients how to protect themselves from being traced, either through social media apps such as Facebook, or through dedicated tracking apps, or through, it could be through online statements and phone bills as well. We explained to them how to use the incognito mode on web browsers, within game sort of chat features that could be used to text, and introduce them to digital sort of communication products that did not require an app to be downloaded to their device, their phone device. On our end, we also made sure that we paid to enhance the new technologies that we were using at work for privacy purposes. We, of course, supplemented our services work with upstream work, and we did this through public education on social media. I think this is a crucial part of our work because about 40% of Singaporeans are apathetic when it comes to caring about domestic violence, and they tend to think that domestic violence is not prevalent in Singapore and that it rarely occurs. And this is from the 2019 survey that I mentioned earlier. We try and bust these myths, provide resources for people who are living with an abuser right now, and also suggest how you can help as a friend, family member, neighbor, whatever it might be. And for my final slide, which is the next slide, I just wanted to quickly say that there is help available for both male victims of violence as well as for perpetrators. Let me quickly start with male victims, and maybe I can wrap up here. Now, they have access to many of the same resources that female victims do. They can go to the police, they can go to the family violence specialist centers, and they can also seek out counseling resources. For perpetrators, support is provided by the police via something called the Home Team Community Assistance and Referral Scheme. That's a mouthful. But under this scheme, the police refer offenders to social workers who will assess whether their underlying issues need to be addressed through means such as counseling, financial assistance, and refer the offenders to suitable agencies for help. Now, you may wonder, how can counseling help, right? So based on the information that's available on this program, counseling is meant to help the perpetrator recognize that the responsibility of the abuse actually lies in the hands of the perpetrator themselves. So you really want to have to change for counseling to be successful. And trained professionals will often work with abusers to develop alternative ways of expressing themselves, but at the same time, ensuring that their loved ones are safe. And I think that counseling can also help to challenge beliefs that have often contributed to the individual's use of violence as an emotion. Let me stop here, and I can come back for questions later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shailey. I think there is a next slide with all the helplines. Next one. Yep, I think if you may want to take a picture of this slide, I think very, very useful numbers to keep on hand. Thank you very much, Shailey. I think you have really shared very, very useful information. I think one thing that really struck me is that violence is not an uncontrollable act. So that can be actually controlled. So thank you for sharing on the various forms of domestic violence, the prevalent myths about domestic violence, and identifying signs of abuse and ways to provide support to domestic violence victims. And now we have Chee Jia, who will talk about how the law can help victims of domestic violence and harassment. And she'll be covering the Personal Protection Orders, PPO, Protection from Harassment Act, POHA, as well as how the law views various types of violence and harassment. Over to you, Chee Jia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline, and Shailey as well for sharing about the different types of domestic violence we have. Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit more about the legal recourses that we have in situations of domestic violence and harassment as well. What we have here is just an overview so that it's a little bit clearer for us to see what we can do in situations of violence or harassment. So Shailey just now covered some of the hotlines that AWARE has, the other FSCs as well. Can we go back, please? Yes, that we can tap into for victims of domestic violence or harassment. Importantly, family and friends as well, the support system surrounding the victim, that's very important. So in a situation where somebody experiences perhaps an acute incident of domestic violence, you might want to then make a police report. So in these instances, when the police is called in, right, they might then investigate the matter. They would then decide whether or not to prefer criminal charges against the perpetrator. So that's one thing that can happen, right? It could end up with criminal charges. The other thing that commonly people talk about is getting personal protection orders. That falls under the family court. And then protection orders as well now under the POHA. So these are the two other things that you can do. If, for example, the police do not follow up with criminal charges, and even if they do, you can also file for PPO or protection order under POHA, right, in order to protect yourself against violence. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off with personal protection orders first. PPOs are only obtainable through the family justice courts. It only applies to family members. So it doesn't apply to everyone. as opposed to the protection order that I mentioned just now under POHA. So I'll cover that later on in my presentation. So what a PPO does is it's an order essentially restraining a person from using family violence against another family member. So the things that need to be shown are whether if family violence has been committed or is likely to be committed against a family member, whether or not it's necessary for the order to be made to protect the family member. And this is assessed on a balance of probabilities. Next slide, please. So then the natural question is, which family members are covered? So I think often when we think about domestic violence, we think a lot about spousal violence, right? So it would apply for a spouse, even a former spouse, but we often neglect that there's this huge other list of family members that are also covered. So children, for example, the father or mother of the victim, in-laws are also covered, brother or sister, siblings are covered as well. In fact, any other relative or an incapacitated person that the court deems should be regarded as a member of the family in the circumstances, that can also be covered. And a relative includes any person related through marriage, right? So your in-laws and all that will fall in there, and also through adoption. Next slide, please. So what is family violence for the purposes of a personal protection order, right? It is generally classed into 4 types of family violence. The first one being causing fear of hurt, so willfully or knowingly placing or attempting to place a family member in fear of hurt, right? The second one being causing actual hurt to a family member. The third one, wrongfully confining or restraining a family member against his will. And the fourth one being continual harassment with the intent to cause or knowing that it is likely to cause anguish to a family member. So for the first 3 types that I covered, these usually would cover incidents of physical hurt, physical violence. Whereas number 4 here, it's a slightly broader definition. It covers continual harassment, right? Things that would cause anguish towards a family member. So interestingly, what this does exclude is force lawfully used in self-defense, number 1, and secondly, force by way of correction to a child below 21 years. So if, for example, you cane your child, that may fall under an exclusion depending on the circumstances. Next slide. Okay. The types of personal protection orders that we can obtain and the effects, right? There are a couple of types. The most common being the first one, the personal protection order itself, right? In some instances where there is an imminent danger for the victim of the abuse, you can apply for an expedited order at the point the application is made. Other types of less common PPOs would be domestic exclusion order, where you are able to exclude the perpetrator from your residence, right? And the last one being a counseling order. So the effects of a PPO and an EO, an expedited order, is that the respondent is not allowed to perpetrate family violence against a protected person. And contravention of any PPO or EO or DOCO results in arrest and criminal penalties. Next slide. So briefly, I'll cover the PPO court process, what is involved when you're trying to make an application. You would file an application in person at the Family Justice Courts, or you can fill in the details on iFAMS, which is an online platform, and then go down to court to formalize the application before a duty judge. A summons is then issued, and then it will be served on the respondent before the first court date. So what happens is at the first court date, parties will attend, complainant and respondent will attend, or rather perpetrator and victim will attend. And then there will be an exchange of affidavits over a few court attendances, and the case will then be fixed for trial. So that would be the full suite of the court process. Of course, during this process, often what is involved is the court would order or direct that parties go for counseling. So if during this process, the perpetrator and the victim come to some sort of agreement through the counseling process, you often get a PPO ordered by consent without having to go through what may be traumatic, the course of a trial. So circling back to who can make the application, right? The victim of the family violence themselves can make the application, or a parent or guardian or relative or person responsible for the care if the victim is below 21 years or if the victim is incapacitated in some way. Small category here of victim below 21 years of age, they can apply under special circumstances. For example, people who are married below the age of 21, they can apply for themselves or their children. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm now going to cover the POHA, right, Protection from Harassment Act. So this is something that kicked in relatively recently in the past couple of years, right? Essentially what this act does is it criminalizes harassing behaviors. So previously it was the case that a lot of people felt harassed, they felt like there was some sort of domestic violence perpetrated, but they didn't have any recourse under the PPO. First of all, perhaps because they are not family members of the person of the perpetrator. So what is special about POHA is that it's applicable to anyone, not just family members. So often it becomes an alternative for relationships that may have that nexus, but are strictly not covered under PPOs. So with POHA, it criminalizes harassment, certain types of harassing behavior, and these offenses can be found at sections 3 to 7 of POHA. I will not go into the specifics because it can get quite legalistic, but what I've done is I've generally summarized what kind of behavior is covered under POHA, and this can be threatening, abusive, or insulting words, behavior, or communication. That's one. Secondly, intentionally publishing identity information of a targeted person, right? Something that kicked in quite recently, I think 2020, this is the offense of doxing. Behavior that causes fear of violence or provocation of violence. And then unlawful stalking as well, which there's a whole list of behaviors that could be regarded as unlawful stalking. So some of the examples are following the victim or the related person, loitering around their home, loitering around their place of work, sending emails, for example, to the victim's colleagues with suggestive comments of the victim, or circulating revealing photos of the victim to their acquaintances. So in all, this kind of behavior, when it causes the victim rather to feel harassed, to feel alarmed or distressed, right? That is when it generally becomes a problem, becomes an offense. So when it actually causes the victim to feel that way on a situation where the accused ought to know that the victim would hear these things, the victim would feel harassed, alarmed, or distressed at such behavior. Next slide, please. So criminal penalties under POHA. So I mentioned just now that these have become criminalized. These are offenses now. So in general, right, each specific offense has its own penalty. So in general, the fines go up to $5,000 and could include and/or a jail term of up to 12 months, depending on the offense. There are enhanced penalties for subsequent offenses, right, up to 10,000 or 2 years jail. And interestingly, there are also enhanced penalties for victims in vulnerable positions. So for example, victims that are that by reason of mental or physical infirmity, disability, or incapacity, right, they're not really able to protect themselves from abuse, neglect, under the hands of the perpetrator, right? You get enhanced penalties in such situations. There are also enhanced penalties for victims in intimate relationships. So just now I mentioned, if your relationship doesn't strictly fall under a PPO, sometimes it does fall under the purview of POHA. So intimate relationships, something that also needs to be assessed based on the act. There is a list of factors that we usually have to go through, right? The court then determines whether or not this relationship can be considered an intimate relationship. And you need to show that this relationship has adversely affected the victim's ability to protect themselves from the harm caused by the accused. Next slide, please. So the criminal processes under POHA, right? The offenses that I mentioned just now at sections 3 to 7, right? The police could choose to prefer charges, right? They could choose to refer on, and then the AGC may prosecute So this is what might happen. You make a police report, the police and the AGC will follow up. Person is charged in court. The second type of criminal process under POHA would be the magistrate's complaint, or what is commonly called private prosecution process. So what you would do is you file a complaint at the state courts. The complainant attends in person before a duty magistrate, right, to swear to the details of the complaint. And then the magistrate may then direct a suite of things, right? They may send this case back for the police to investigate. They may direct the matter for criminal mediation, after which a perpetrator and victim could possibly come to a settlement agreement, and then the case is taken off, or the complaint could be dismissed. And lastly, it could also be possible that the magistrate directs private prosecution. So in this case, essentially, it means that the victim would have to engage their own lawyers to privately prosecute the perpetrator. So it is, in a sense, a prosecution that is done by the victim themselves, a private prosecution, as opposed to something done by the AGC, the state. Next slide, please. So civil remedies under POHA, that is what people are usually most interested in, right? The first thing that you would be looking at would be the protection order or the expedited protection order. These are for behaviors of harassment. The list here, stop publication order, correction order, all of these, I won't be going into this today because otherwise the presentation will run on too long. These mostly relate to making false statements. These are the orders that can be made here. So I'll just be talking about protection orders and the EPO, right? And lastly, another civil remedy under POHA would be damages, the ability to get monetary compensation. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a bit about the protection order. Essentially, what happens when you get one is that you get an order against the harasser to stop harassing or stalking the victim, or to remove any publication that is the cause of the harassment, right? And what you need to show on a balance of probabilities is that the respondent has committed a POHA offense, that the harassment is likely to continue, or one of the POHA harassment offenses is likely to be committed, and that is just and equitable under the circumstances for the order to be made. In the instance of an EPO, expedited protection order, right, you can sometimes request for this at the point of making your PO application. And if there is prima facie evidence, that just means evidence on the face of it that the respondent has committed a POHA offense and is likely to continue, there is a substantial adverse effect on the victim if the harassment continues on without any EPO stopping it in the interim. And that is just an equitable for the expedited order to be made. Then the magistrate may go ahead to order the EPO. Next slide, please. So the protection order process, what you will need to do is go to e-litigation, which is an online filing system that we have for litigation in Singapore. You can go on there to file your application, or you can do it in person at the 𝐜𝐴𝐺𝐻 Service Bureau, which I believe is now at Chinatown Point. And what you would need to do is to bring along an ex parte originating summons and a supporting affidavit, and file the application on eLit or on at 𝐜𝐴𝐺𝐻. The application would then need to be served on the respondent. The respondent will file a response, and a pre-trial conference and a subsequent hearing date will be fixed. And for EPO applications, expedited protection order applications, if you were to request for this at the point of making the application, the PO application, then an urgent PTC and hearing will be fixed together within 2 days of making the application. And at that hearing, directions will be made for service of the EPO if it's granted, or of the summons for the PO. And then the next steps would also be made at that hearing. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was my last slide in relation to PO. I've come back now to the very, very beginning, the overview that I talked about right in the beginning, and hopefully this makes a little bit more sense. Just to recap, so if an incident of violence happens, if an incident of violence or harassment happens, what you can do is get that support system in place, speak up to the hotlines and all that if you need. And you could also make a police report. And in order to protect yourself in the appropriate situation, circumstances, you can make the application for a personal protection order at the FJC, or you can make an application for a protection order under POHA. So I hope that briefly summarizes the process in an understandable way. And I think I'll hand over the time back to Jacqueline.
Thanks a lot, Chee Jia. That was a wonderful summary. It saved me the job of summarizing the two wonderful parts by Shailey and yourself. And 𝐜𝐤, can I just have the next slide, please, 𝐜𝐤? Yep, so these are our practice areas. And the next slide. I think on the, yep, these are our contacts. You may want to just take a picture if you would like to contact us if you should need any assistance. Okay, and then the next, yeah, okay. We'll be going on to the Q&A, but please do help us by just taking by scanning the QR code, and to give us feedback on this webinar. So we really want to improve with every webinar that we do. Thank you. So we have some questions here on the side. I think the first question was asked was how to file the PPO, personal protection order, which you have covered, right, Chee Jia?
Yes, I think I've covered
Yeah,
the
okay, great. Then there's another question sent to me privately. I think this is probably for Shailey. What if there are children in the home? Are they at risk? Should I report to MSF or even police if the adult victim is reluctant to?
So I think it's really difficult to give advice based on limited sort of information, right? I mean, we would ideally like to know more about what kind of abuse, whether or not there are responsible sort of adults that could help the child. So yeah, it's a little difficult to sort of respond to that question without more details.
Right. So if you should need some help, I think you could always call the AWARE hotline. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And share more information. Every case is different, right? Every case is unique. And there are so many different sort of factors contributing to each case that once we better understand what exactly the case you have in mind, we'll be able to tailor our advice, our practical sort of advice, our emotional support to that situation.
Thank you. The next, what do you do if your friend, the victim, insists on accepting the abuse because marriage is private and her son needs his father?
So I actually tried responding to this in the chat.
Yeah,
right?
I think you did. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I do think that it's just as an overarching sort of principle, important to remember that we must be led by what the victim wants to do, right? We can't force somebody to leave an abusive relationship because we don't fully understand why they continue to stay in that abusive relationship. It could be because of so many different reasons, and I've tried to list some of those reasons in the chat as well.
Yeah.
So just being led by the victim, I think, is really important.
Thank you. I think this question is for Chee Jia. Since the laws with respect to domestic violence favor women, what happens if both spouses exert physical violence towards each other, physical force towards each other?
Okay, I think, hello? Okay, to make clear, the laws with respect to domestic violence, they are for both sexes. There is no favor towards women. And if both spouses exert physical force towards each other, that's actually something quite common that I see personally in my experience. We just call them cross PPO applications, cross personal protection order applications, often with the same incident reported by both spouses. So that can happen as well.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think there's another question. How long is a PPO good or valid for?
Right. So usually when a PPO is ordered, the court would fix the matter for review, typically within 6 months. So parties will have to attend before the court again. And then after a PPO order is made, actually, often parties are sent for follow-up counseling as well to help them through the situation. And then the court would send the matter back for review, usually around 6-month mark. And then we would see whether or not it's necessary to continue extending the PPO.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thank you so much. I think maybe at this point, if you haven't, scanned the PR code for our feedback, please do so. It would really mean a lot to us. It would really help us a lot as well. And I think it might be good to again flash the slide, Yuling, if you can, on all the helplines. So people who haven't had a chance to get a snapshot, I think they might want to do that. Yeah. Okay, I think the questions are that for now. Would you have any comments, Shailey or Chee Jia, something which you might want to reinforce with your audience?
I think I would just want to add to Shailey's response about the victim who said that marriage is private and her son needs his father. So I think that's absolutely true what Shailey mentioned, that it's a very personal situation, right? So we have to respect the victim in these cases. And I think we also need to recognize that for a lot of victims of violence, it's a work in progress. So it's about helping them, supporting them through that journey, and then seeing what they need or what they feel like they require at that point. A lot of victims, they may feel like it's kind of like the battered wife syndrome. You sit in there and you think that, oh, this is normal, or this is how it should go. But giving the victims that support can help them slowly come to the realization, perhaps, that they need to take some action, that they need to do something in order to get out of this situation. But we really can't force anybody to do that, and we can slowly support them into figuring out what's best for them.
You've very, very well summarized. Shailey, anything that you'd like to add? Shailey, can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, right. Does anyone else have any questions at this point? You may feel free to unmute yourself if you want, if it's quicker to just ask versus just typing. Okay, and I think, Yuling, can you just show the QR code for the webinar?
I have a direct message question to me that I will read out.
Okay.
The question is, what if the victim is afraid to face the legal process in terms of confrontation? So I do get that it can be very scary. And we do sometimes have these cases, and it means that the victim is then put off from making any sort of application, because they will then ask me, do I need to see the respondent? Do I also need to be there in the same room as him or her? Yeah, and the key thing to know about this is that during the initial stages of the process, when you make the complaint and all that, the victim is there themselves. The first time they will need to meet the respondent in person will be at the first court mention. And during that process, it's a crowded courtroom, right? Right now with the COVID situation, that may have changed, but I believe that courtroom is still open, right? It's a crowded courtroom. There are other people in there, and each party they go to separate sides of the room, and you really don't have to speak with the respondent personally at any point. You can have other people come in here and help you, but you do have to attend court together at the same time. And then when it does get down to the trial process, right, it might be something quite traumatic to go through. There are facilities actually to help victims that may feel like they cannot be in the same space as the respondent. There is a little room at the back of the courtroom where you can sit in there, or some judges even allow video link testimony. So there is a support system in place to help people that really feel like they're too afraid to see the perpetrator.
All right. Thank you for that really good information. So any more questions? The last call for questions for both Shailey as well as Chee Jia. Okay, if not, thank you so much for really sitting with us, with Aware and with Fortis Law. And we hope that you have actually, that you will actually walk away with good information. And if there's anything that you need assistance, please do not hesitate to contact us or Aware, or any of those helplines that we have shared, the contact numbers. So thank you very much once again, and we look forward to sharing more good information with you, information on topics that you will find interesting. Thank you. Thanks, Shailey. Thanks, Chee Jia. Thanks, everybody, and have a very restful evening. Bye-bye.